Coming up on this Finding Truth Prophetic Network interview.
Does it go against what I know of who God is based on my personal relationship experience with him? If so, then it very likely is not true.
Eat the meat and spit out the bones. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Finding Truth Prophetic Network. My name is Krista Dunk, and I have a question for you today. How do you feel about suffering? Not your favorite topic, probably, I would imagine, to talk about, or actually more like to experience. But we have a super interesting segment today discussing the topic of suffering. And I have my author, client, and friend, Emily Benjamin, who is on with me today, who has an amazing new book that's out. It's called Hard But Good, a spiritual exploration of suffering. And so we're going to be talking about that today. So welcome, Emily. I'm so glad that you're here today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Great to see you again. We've been chatting over the months with your book project, and this is something that I feel like has been near and dear to your heart, and it's something that God has you working on, but it's really, I think, more so a journey that God has taken you on when it comes to a lot of your life experience. And I think that book title that you chose, Hard But Good, is, yeah, that says a lot there about how it's been for you. And so I guess take just a minute and if you would, let everybody know kind of why you felt like you needed to write this book and kind of how that's been for you in the process of writing it.
Yeah, definitely. I guess I would say, well, my experiences of suffering, I think, go all the way back to my earliest memories in life. I don't really have memories of a time in my life where there wasn't a lot of pain and suffering experiences going on until much later in adulthood. And I really struggled growing up and in young adulthood trying to understand why I had experienced so much difficulty, so much pain in my life, and what on earth I was supposed to do about it, how to deal with it, how to try to live a normal, functional life despite all of these things. And it was quite a struggle for a long time. But when I would say maybe about 7 years ago, I had really a spiritual awakening, I guess you could say. I'd been a Christian for all of my adult life. I grew up in the church, had, concepts of God and Christianity, and even believed those concepts, but hadn't really had much experience with God himself until my early 20s. But then even after that, I guess I would say salvation experience, I didn't really have much of a spiritual life, I would say, until about 7 years ago. And when I really met the Holy Spirit for the first time, I would say, and everything in my life began to change. I began to just consume Christian content at a really breakneck pace. I tried to learn everything I could about the spiritual world, and then that led into understanding a great deal about my own soul and the things that were going on in there, and why I had certain struggles or difficulties or tendencies toward certain behaviors or thought patterns or things like that. And really early on in that process, God began to speak to me about this understanding of what pain and suffering in this earthly life is all about, how and why it happens, and just really what we can do with it when we experience it. So I would say it's been over the course of some years, the past few years, where God has just sort of been gradually expanding my understanding and my revelation of how he uses suffering in our lives, even though he's not the source of it, and what the purpose of us having to experience it really is.
I love how you just said he's not the source of our suffering, but he has a lot to say about it. He can do a lot in our lives with it, through it, but he also wants to heal us from the traumas. And I feel like just knowing your story, having helped you with your book, you have experienced a lot of suffering and of various different kinds, like through various, sources and things like that. So you definitely are someone who has a lot to say on this topic. And I really love how in your book too, you are not only explaining your story, and some of that, we'll go into that in just a second, but you also have had a lot of conversations with the Lord about it and have some really great understanding of it. But then you also allow people to see how to heal, how to overcome, how to just resolve some things with the Lord in your soul. Somebody has experienced suffering too. And I know you're someone who has been in church leadership. You've had that experience in your life over the years. And you say something in your book about how the church really isn't good necessarily at addressing the topic of suffering typically. And yet it's something that to some degree all of us experience in life. And so that's super interesting. I'd love to hear your thoughts on maybe why that is. And then also too, if you could just tell a few pieces of your story and different things so people understand your background when it comes to the topic of suffering.
Sure. Yeah, I think as far as the church goes, in my experience, I would say at least American churches, I'm not sure about everywhere in the world, but in American churches, there tend to be kind of two different camps of theology when it comes to suffering. One is God uses or he puts us into suffering or he causes suffering to teach us important lessons about life. And I would say the other end of the spectrum, which tends to be more in the kind of charismatic Pentecostal arena, is, God has nothing to do with our suffering. He obviously doesn't cause any of it. He doesn't want us to suffer. And I would say that there are definitely important truths in that concept that we often hear from the more charismatic end of Christianity. God does not cause our suffering. He does not want us to suffer. He doesn't get any sort of enjoyment or even satisfaction of us learning lessons or whatever because we're suffering. It's not like he's doing that to us. But I think there's kind of either you could call it a middle ground or maybe just a different perspective altogether, which is that God is not the author of our suffering, but he does actually require us to experience suffering in this life. It is a part of the human physical existence on earth, and it is required of us. There's not a human being alive that's never experienced any sort of pain or suffering. And, Jesus himself, his entire mission in the world when he came here was really accomplished through deep and difficult suffering, both, obviously physically on the cross and all of those experiences he had, but also emotionally. We can see in the scripture different points where Jesus is just really in deep emotional struggle and pain over the things that he will have to do in this life. And I think we've sort of lost a bit of that in the modern church, the understanding that God does require us to suffer in the accomplishing of the things that he has for us to do here on the earth.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus himself said, in this world you will have troubles. I'll give you my peace. And so that.
Yeah, and I kind of think that if we look way back in history to kind of the early church fathers, they had a much different perspective on the experience of human suffering than we tend to have in the modern church. And I really feel like they really understood some things that we've kind of lost in both in this mentality that God is putting us into suffering situations to teach us lessons, and in the mentality that he doesn't have anything whatsoever to do with it. I think it's not any of those, and I think the early church fathers really had a much greater grasp of the role that suffering plays in a Christian's life and the things that it accomplishes, not just in our lives, but for the kingdom and just for every single person who's experiencing that suffering.
Wow, the things that it accomplishes. That is a really powerful thought. So, okay, we are going to continue this conversation with Emily Benjamin, and right after this quick break. So we'll be right back.
Has God called you to be his scribe? Do you carry messages from God's heart that are meant to be shared through writing? The International Prophetic Writers Association is an online community where prophetic writers can find author training, support, encouragement, confidence, and vision for their kingdom assignment. So if you're called to write and make a meaningful difference in the lives of others, learn more now at internationalpwa.com.
All right, thanks for coming back. My name is Krista, and I am with Emily Benjamin, and we are talking about her new book that's called Hard But Good, A Spiritual Exploration of Suffering. And so before the break, we started, you had a thought that really hit me with the things that suffering accomplishes. And it made me think, in the Christian world, I feel like we always want to kind of run away from suffering and pain, and we want to get back to a place of problem-free, whatever it is. If we're sick, we want to get back to a place of health. If we have an issue in finances, we want to get that solved as fast as possible. Every, relational things, we just want them to be done very quickly. And that's our tendency. And yet you're saying suffering accomplishes things within us. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, suffering, in my experience, and I think in the experience of many people, it really does accomplish a lot in us. I think maybe what you're hitting on there plays into a little bit the idea of the American dream to some extent. I think it's natural for any human being to want to avoid pain or suffering. It's kind of a natural instinct. We move away from things that hurt us. And this isn't a bad thing to do. It's not a bad instinct. It saves a lot of people's lives from horrible things that could really, kill them or harm them. But at the same time, we have a lot we can learn from experiences of suffering. And I think, at least in American culture in the United States, there's a lot of this idea of reaching for like the ideal, which is luxury, comfort, being in a place where you just don't have to do anything hard, and the American dream kind of goes back to this idea. You work really hard for so many years, you save up enough money, and then you can retire and just sort of relax for the rest of your life in a nice house. Maybe you have a boat or, some other toy that you want, adult toy, and just sort of relax for the rest of your life. And I think it is sort of an ingrained piece in our culture specifically, is that we are working towards living in comfort and ease without hardship, without difficulty. And while I'm not saying there's anything wrong with having those goals, I think it has sort of skewed our perception of what we are supposed to be doing here as believers specifically. Because, as I said, Jesus's mission on this earth was accomplished through suffering, and God has a lot for us to accomplish, and a lot of that can't be accomplished if we don't experience pain and suffering in life. And there's a lot of Christians I've known over the years that have had a very protective mindset about life. They want to raise their kids kind of in a bubble away from the world and the bad things. And again, to a certain extent, like certainly there's wisdom in not just letting your kids be exposed to everything that's out there, but the idea that we are supposed to live in safety as believers it's really not biblical. It's not biblical at all. I mean, Jesus, as you said before, he basically promised us, in this life you will have trials, you will have pain and suffering. It is a part of this life. And some of the things that I have personally found, and that I think probably, again, the early church fathers understood about suffering, is the things that it accomplishes within us. And without those things being grown in us, we cannot really, for the most part, accomplish the dreams and goals that God has for us in this life, the things that we were made to do and that we're called to do. Because suffering, honestly, you can't become mature without it. You cannot become a mature person or a mature believer without going through difficulty and suffering and being able to hang on to the things that you know about God, His goodness, the things that we understand about this life throughout that, and coming out the other side, understanding and knowing even more.
That's really good. Yeah. He's growing some things in us
Absolutely.
that we really need.
Yeah.
We really, really need. Yeah. Fellowship of his suffering too. I know Paul speaks of that
Yeah.
New Testament too. So that's a thing. That's a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think, I always love what Bill Johnson says about Jesus being perfect theology. If he healed every person he saw, then that's what our goal should be. The same kind of thing. But I think it also applies to this type of concept. If Jesus had to go through intense suffering in order to accomplish his mission, his calling on this earth, I don't think that we really have the right to expect that we can live out this life in kind of a place of ease and comfort where we just sort of, live in our comfortable bubble, and every now and then we try to evangelize some non-believers, but it's never really too hard or too painful.
Good point. That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Okay. And if you would just for a moment, just so people can kind of understand a little bit of your background too, when it comes to suffering, can you just let us know some of the things in your life that you have experienced quickly? And then I think I would like to talk with you more about the, ways to find healing. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I would start way back in very early childhood. I grew up in a very dysfunctional, abusive home. Ironically, my father was a pastor, but in my home growing up, I experienced, I think, just about every form of abuse that you could think of that's listed as abuse anywhere in the world. Sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, spiritual abuse. In my home and in the church that my father was pastoring while I was growing up, there was a lot of religion, a lot of control. So there's a lot of dysfunction in my life. And I would say there weren't really any people in any way in my life that I could sort of rely on or go to for safety. There's a lot of research that's shown even if kids grow up in difficult or abusive environments, if they have at least, one person that they can go to for comfort or help or whatever, that their outcomes in life turn out to be a lot better. But I did not have a single person, not a friend, not an adult, not a sibling, not anyone that I could go to that could sort of help me emotionally process all of the things I was experiencing in life. And this kind of led to other forms of suffering later in life after I actually moved out of my parents' home. I think because I was so conditioned to live in, dysfunction and abuse, I was inevitably drawn to partners that were abusive and manipulative and controlling. And I wouldn't think at the beginning that that's the way they were. I would always think like, oh, no, this is a different person. They're not like that, but inevitably they always turned out to be that way. And, I had to realize at some point that I was being subconsciously and probably spiritually drawn to people that I could sense that dysfunction in, because it's the place I knew how to survive in was dysfunction. I didn't know how to live in a functional world.
It was familiar. Yeah.
Exactly. And I had developed a lot of skills for how to live in dysfunction and not really any skills for how to live in a functional world.
Wow.
At the same time, something that I sort of began to suspect in early adulthood, but didn't really have confirmed till later on, was that I am actually autistic. And so my experiences of the world in some ways, in some arenas, were even, I would say, more difficult than what a neurotypical child would have experienced. I didn't really understand a lot of expectations of me, and unfortunately my parents were both very, very concerned about what people thought of our family and the public perception of things. And so I ended up getting a lot of shame, humiliation, and punishment for just accidental social mistakes and things like that, to the point where I sort of learned that it was just safer to be quiet, to just don't speak, don't make yourself visible, don't do anything that draws attention to you. And that's sort of the way I continued to live my life well into adulthood. And then when I was in college, I began to have a lot of really difficult health conditions. And these would be health conditions that would just kind of pop up one day and just never go away. I think I could probably list half a dozen off the top of my head. Some of the worst ones. I developed chronic fatigue syndrome. I developed gout. I developed a condition with my bladder that sort of made me feel like I need to use the bathroom all the time, 24 hours a day. I developed pretty intense tendonitis in my hands that didn't go away no matter what treatment was done. And so I had a really hard time using my hands for things. I developed a weird autoimmune disorder where I just could not eat anything but like 3 different items. And that lasted for about 5 years. And these things, most of them were just kind of happening at the same time. So I'd get one health condition, it would stay while I was still having that health condition. Another one would pop up, that would stay. So at one point, I think I was dealing with like 6 or 7 different health conditions simultaneously that all required, different dietary restrictions and different, things that I needed to do to try to live functionally. And it was a big mess. I had started out my life with a lot of dreams for what I was going to accomplish in life, and this just sort of took me out of every path that I'd set myself on, every dream and goal that I had. It just sort of slipped away, and there didn't really seem to be anything I could do about it. Doctors had no answers for just about anything. And it was a difficult time. I've since come to learn and understand that a lot of that had to do with the abuse I experienced in childhood, because when children are denied loving, safe, supportive relationships and are in abusive environments where they're not allowed to really have a voice or express emotion or really be their own individual person, if you can't get the pain out, then it just goes in and it starts causing a lot of physical dysfunction. And I mean, this has been a scientifically researched phenomenon. It's not uncommon for people who've experienced a lot of abuse in childhood to end up with chronic, debilitating health conditions. And so that's kind of the direction my life went. Even though I graduated college, I, got an advanced degree and all of these things, I couldn't even pursue the career path that I had set out to pursue because I couldn't even hardly function physically on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like it. Yeah. Well, I just want to say, if anyone's watching what you just described and they're maybe relating to certain pieces of what you just said, and I just want to say this to you, Emily, too. I'm so sorry for what you had to endure in your life. That is not the way it's supposed to be. And so if there's anyone else watching who has experienced some of those things, I just pray for people to find healing from those things. And I'm so sorry you had to experience that. And let's talk about that next, after this quick break, about some of the things you learned, like the healing process that God took you through. I think that's really important. Okay, we'll be right back.
Over the millennia, people have sought to understand why we suffer. How could a good God allow suffering? And what, if anything, is to be done with our pain? In author Emily Benjamin's new book, Hard But Good, she shares how God took her through the process of healing from many wounds and traumas, giving her deep and insightful revelations about human suffering that transformed her from a broken victim into a powerful voice for freedom. If you've experienced suffering, get your copy of this impactful book today on Amazon.
Okay, we are back with Emily, and I love what you were just sharing and how you said you were conditioned towards dysfunction and you really had no life skills that were about no skills for living in healthy environments at that time. And so I know that God took you on quite a journey of a healing process, and you had some amazing visions and dreams and things, really just spending time in his presence. And so I want to just list out some of the healing process things that you listed in your book, Hard But Good. And I like how you say that this is a quote from the book. If we think of the soul's healing as a cake, there are various components or ingredients that must be in the recipe. And you list these things: understanding, revelation, internalization, forgiveness, our will, our choices, time, grace, community, deliverance, open-mindedness, and discernment. And I love how each one of those in the book, you really talk about each one in detail. But if there are a couple you want to mention right now that can leave people with some information about how they can go through a healing process if they've experienced some suffering in their lives.
Yeah, definitely. So I feel like a lot of these are things that are talked about a fair amount in kind of the Christian healing, inner healing world. There's a lot of people that have information out there about, forgiveness and, the God's grace and just things like that. So I think those ones, they're really important to know, but I think I'll probably pick out a couple that I feel like a lot of Christians get tripped up on when they're going through the healing process, and that would be open-mindedness and discernment. And I like to think about those two as two sides of the same coin, even though they're sort of going in a little bit opposite directions. So with open-mindedness, I feel like a lot of Christians get stuck in this idea that the only places I can learn things or glean things from in my healing process or even in life is from Christian sources that align with my specific theology. There seems to be a lot of maybe fear in the Christian world about hearing information or ideas that don't come from the specific Christian stream that I have found myself in or that I've decided to follow. And I think this is really detrimental to healing. I think I've known people that are like, yeah, I really want to heal from this trauma or this pain, but I can't really find any good resources to help me understand this or things to learn. And, when it comes out in the end, it's because they're unwilling to read, psychological studies that were published by secular institutions. They're unwilling to read even Christian content that comes from a theological perspective that they're not particularly comfortable with. And I think what we really need to keep in mind in the healing process, and probably just for life and growth in general, is that God can use anything. He's not limited to one specific arena. Even if you think that you have it all right and you've got the lockdown on every theological idea that God could have out there and you've just got it all down pat, it's really an unhealthy and an unhelpful spot to put yourself in. And, if I might say, perhaps a little bit arrogant to think there's no other people out there in the world that have anything to tell me that doesn't come from what I've already accepted. And I think we really have to understand, if what we've already accepted was going to heal us, then we probably would have been healed by now. And we just really have to be open-minded to understand that God will speak to you through many different ways. In my healing process, sometimes it was difficult to find even Christian material on certain topics that I knew I needed to address in my process of healing. And it's because, unfortunately, the Christian world is kind of far behind in the area of, psychology and inner healing. There's certainly some good ministries out there that are doing really good work right now in that arena, but it took a while for those to come about. And in the meantime, the secular world of psychology has been doing decades of research into the human mind and emotions that we haven't quite caught up to yet. And so, I would just say, in my own experience, in my own life, I was very surprised at some of the places that I actually found what I needed to help understand and process my experiences of pain in life, suffering, and how God used those resources or those people or those research studies to help me heal when they were from sources that a lot of believers I know would be like, oh, well, you can't trust this or you can't trust that if it doesn't fall exactly within these narrow Christian parameters. Yeah. God's just not limited. He's not limited. And, the Bible's very clear that all good things come down from the Father of lights. All good things are from God. And his image is in every human being, whether they're a Christian or not. And because of that, every human being is driven to want to understand truth. And so it only makes sense that there would be people who don't yet know God, who still have been driven to find truth and understanding, and that they would have something to offer us that maybe we haven't found in any other place.
That's really good. And then I think then maybe the second side of that coin, the discernment to know, well, what is godly wisdom?
Yeah,
It is truth,
yeah,
and what is really going way off that you should not.
right.
Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, so absolutely. I think open-mindedness is really important, but I think you shouldn't do open-mindedness without some level of discernment. Because even though God will show up in, really unexpected ways and places, he also wants us to be able to judge what is and is not really coming from him. And there's a lot of I would say secular resources out there that I found in my process of healing where I found some little bit of information or a nugget of truth or something, and it really just hit me like, yes, that's exactly what I'm dealing with, but in the same exact resource, the same book or the same, podcast or whatever, they would say something that I was like, oh, well, I know that that's not true because that is not biblical. It's in fact anti-biblical. It goes against what the Bible says, and so I know that not to be true. And I think if we can learn to use this discernment or this wisdom in what we take in our process of growth and healing, I think it really will help us go very far in the process. And I think, just some really general standards. Does it go against what the Bible says? Then we know it, that can't be true. That statement can't be true. Does it go against what I know of who God is based on my personal relationship experience with him? If so, then it very likely is not true, because if we have a personal relationship with God, we start to understand his character and the kind of being that he is, and that he wouldn't do or say certain things or direct us to do certain things. So those are two really important pieces. Does it line up with the Bible? Does it line up with what I know of God from my own experience with him? And another really important element of that is, what kind of fruit does it bear? And the Bible says we'll know a tree by its fruit. And I think if we can, look at a statement or an idea from a source that we're not sure about and see what has this created in the world from, people who are using this method or this idea about the human soul or inner healing or, psychology, has this created good, healthy fruit in people's lives? And I think those are just really three important things that we can use to, while we're being open-minded, to kind of make sure that we're not going far off into weird directions.
Yeah, that's really, really good. Yeah, what is the source of that healing and what is the fruit it's producing? And yeah, I feel like, Jesus is the true source of healing for all people. Like there's some things that psychology has figured out, which is great, and there's some medications out there that are helpful and things like that. But like if the full true healing, people need to really go to the Lord. But I love what you're saying is like, I have a friend who says when it comes to gleaning information from sources, it's like eat the meat and spit out the bones.
Yes,
So,
exactly. Yeah.
like there's so much out there. And like you said, there can be really helpful things and bits and nuggets of truth that can be found in many different sources. But yeah, does it go against the Bible? What's the fruit of that? The discernment is so, so important. So, okay, we should wrap this up. But yeah, this has been so good. And I feel like people will get a lot out of what you're saying, Emily. And I know people will get a lot out of your book if they're interested in hearing more and more about your journey, and even some, for all of you watching, I know this book and I know all of the amazing things that Emily has in it, and just talk about some supernatural visions and things that you experienced and encounters with the Lord too, that I think are fascinating. Maybe we can talk about that a different day.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would recommend anyone listening who you're finding this conversation intriguing, interesting, even maybe healing in some ways, go to Amazon and look up Emily's book, Hard But Good, A Spiritual Exploration of Suffering. And on Amazon, available Kindle paperback. Yeah, go and get your copy. So any last thought for someone who's watching, Emily, just as they're walking away from this interview?
Yeah, I would say specifically to people that have experienced a lot of suffering and are really wanting to heal, to come out the other side of it, whole and able to really pursue the things that God has for them. I would just say, it's for me, from my personal experience, it's been somewhat of a long, arduous journey. There's been a lot of moments where I've been like, you know what, God, I can't do it anymore. It's too painful. It's too hard. I'm done. And, his grace has showed up every time. Every single time he shows up. And, I might be sort of having a bit of a meltdown or tantrum for a couple of days. And then God's kind of like, okay, let's keep going. And I just want to say, it likely will be hard, like everything else. It'll be hard, but good, because God will show up in those difficult moments. And if you are committed to this process with him, you will come out the other side. God's not going to let you invest your time and your energy and your heart into a process of healing and then leave you still broken in the end. He will show up and he will bring you through it. And it is so worth it in the end. It's so worth it.
So worth it. He will finish the work that he has started in you if you'll go on this journey with him to get healing from trauma, suffering, abuse, whatever that looks like. So yes, thank you so much, Emily.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yes, I've loved our time together. So, okay, remember, go to Amazon, Hard But Good, Kindle and paperback, Emily Benjamin. Thank you so much. And thank you all for watching this episode today on Finding Truth Prophetic Network. And you can go to findingtruthpropheticnetwork.com to learn more about us, and just praying blessings over all of your day today, everyone's day. And we will see you next time here. Blessings to you, and bye for now.
Thank you for watching the Finding Truth Prophetic Network. Want to support the kingdom work we're doing here at FTPN? A great way to support us is by simply subscribing to our channel. Click the subscribe button now, and thank you for watching.